All right, welcome everybody. Welcome. So this is the continuation of our On Violence study sequence. Welcome back, everybody. I want to just give a shout out to our co-facilitators for the class session that preceded this study session that includes our prestigious and honorific author, Sarah Haley. So we will be conducting this session of the study sequence the way we have previous ones, in which after I briefly introduce our guest, I'll ask our co-facilitators to jump right into a sequence of just kind of thinking questions, kind of open-ended kind of things to pose to our author, whose book we read very carefully this week. So my own version of an intro, I'm Dylan Rodríguez. I work at University of California, Riverside. I'm in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media Cultural Studies. And it's an honor, actually, really is, to welcome my longtime friend, colleague, comrade, co-conspirator, collaborator, and today guest, Professor Sarah Haley. Sarah, the way I talked about you during the first part of class is as somebody whose work in this book in particular has both inherited and carried forward the tradition that I think a lot of people think about as in some ways having one of its many points of origin in Angela Davis's opening chapter, Women, Race, and Class. So, I want to frame No Mercy here in that stream of Black radical feminist scholarship, archival work, and praxis. But the way I know you is so much more than that, because you're also a deeply present tense organizer, practitioner, and teacher within a Black radical feminist abolitionist tradition who is playing a central role in 21st century abolitionist projects. And that's how we know each other. I think we've known each other 20 years now, maybe longer, like right around 20 years we've known each other. So I just want to say welcome and thank you for coming through. And we're going to just really enjoy our precious 70 minutes with you. I'm just going to tell you that right now. So So as always, I told Sarah not to prepare a thing. I told Sarah there's going to be a conversation with y'all. And with that, I'm gonna open things up right away and ask our first co-facilitator, Anthony, to get us going, and then we'll go from there. I'll do my best to facilitate, and then I know there's going to be at least one question which I want to go back and forth. But Sarah, go ahead. You want to say something?
No, I just want to say I'm really honored to be here. I'm honored by Dylan's words, mostly because he's one of the few people around here who doesn't lie a lot. He's like a deeply honest organizer, scholar. And so,
I lie to certain people. Hey, don't get it wrong. There's certain people.
I don't know. I haven't known you to lie much, Dylan, so it means so much to me. And of course, Dylan's work looms so large in No Mercy here, and I'm really super happy to talk about it. Reading forced passages at that moment, I can say a lot more, but was really paradigm shifting for me. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be here with everyone. This is an amazing crew of folks. I've heard so much about y'all from other speakers. I've met some of you in person. So this is really great. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, folks are really happy you're here. I'm very happy you're here. Anthony, you can get us started. Unmute.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. This book was honestly breathtaking. I will admit that in the beginning, I was kind of just like torn apart, but as I continue to read, like this is really an amazing book. So thank you so much. So part of what I read in the conclusion was how much you came across in terms of like researching for this book, and how, there were other avenues that you could have gone down in terms of all the things you found. I guess what kept you focused and grounded? Like, what did you build this narrative around? Because it was really complex, really just a lot of information. So how did you keep yourself grounded as you were like pulling all of this information together?
Hey, Anthony, thank you for that question. And thank you for the kind words about the book. It's funny because I was looking to try to make a database for a project that's not like my next book project. It was a political project. And so I looked up FileMaker, which is this obsolete program that I used. You know FileMaker. People know FileMaker. Okay.
I'm a millennial. I know.
Okay. So I had hundreds of separate files for every person I came across, whether it's in a convict ledger, you know, where it's just a listing, or whether it's in a clemency file, or whether it's a newspaper account. I had categories and I had files, which makes me a little uncomfortable now to think about it that way, given, you know, the deep critiques around the database, right? And the big data. But I learned a lot from reading Black feminist historians of slavery around what it kind of takes to try to honor the stories that are in fragments, that are fragmentary and that are elusive. And so in some ways, I did a really confounded project of kind of capturing people. Like, what were they arrested for? So there were like, I mean, I tried to look at criminalization as a category of experience, not crime as a category of like law. But I had those categories, and I had, you know, a category with notes. Where are they from? Who were they with? What did they say? So that anchored me. I really was trying to be anchored in every person's account. And yeah, I guess that's how I stayed grounded. There were people who I felt very kind of spiritually connected to. They recurred in the archive. I would find them in a penitentiary keeper's list of quote unquote inmates, and then find them in a clemency file and find a photograph. That was Eliza Cobb for me. And so I tried to stay grounded by thinking about what would have been important for her and what was important for dismantling the conditions under which she lived and the afterlife of those conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lena, you had something next.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your book. Thank you for joining our class. So when I was reading, I was really struck by the way that you write of incarcerated Black women at this time as being conceptualized by white supremacist society as like the monster or demonic through like associations with evil, fire, the grotesque. And it seemed like you were talking about it as a way for white people to construct an other against which they could understand themselves. And it made me think about Christian apophatic theology, like the idea that it's impossible to understand or describe God in kind of mortal language because he's too great or he's too divine. And so people created depictions of monsters and demons to kind of describe him through negation, like how evil those monsters are is how good God is. And I was wondering if you see any parallels or any influences of apophatic theology or religion with the ways that white supremacist society at this time in Georgia conceptualized incarcerated Black women as demonic and almost needed that as a negative mirror through which they could construct their own identity in the first place, and specifically as virtuous and divine.
Wow, that is a really good question. My answer is going to be really limited because I vowed to never engage in two fields. That is religious studies and Black Panther studies, because all it gets you is people mad at you. Present company accepted, Dylan, but I was like, you will just get people very angry no matter what you do. And so I really, you know, I didn't, for example, delve into in chapter 3 when I talk about club women who were very religious figures, deeply Christian, political organizers, that facet of their lives and their beliefs is underdeveloped, I will concede. And I was dealing with so many fields of study, I couldn't really incorporate a kind of Christian theology worldview, either in terms of kind of a like liberatory Christianity or in terms of a normative idea about the other or about evil. So I have to say it wasn't part of my kind of framework of analysis. But what I will say is that I guess what I was focused on in that respect is juridical othering that complicates our understanding of the racialized construction of gender. So I was really, one of my major influences was critical race theory. And the kind of strand of that, that's Patricia Williams, that talks about the construction of the law as objective or as universal or as ahistorical. And so thinking about the ways in which racialized gender operates is codified through the law, through this monstrous other was kind of what I focused on, but I think it would be great to think about the religious connections, the theological connections.
Folks in the chat, thank you for asking that. Folks in the chat made an important point. Essence had a really important, I think, deeply methodological question for you. Essence, you go ahead and ask it. It's really good.
Yeah, because I can't see it because it's referring to something before I joined, I think.
Yes.
That's how we keep you off balance. It's cool.
Hi, Sarah. What an honor it is to speak with you. I want to particularly say I have an affinity for files, and also just how you described there are files for each of the women that you were kind of researching, and probably from what I know is probably many more that you didn't get a chance to include. And I think, yeah, my connection is I wrote this book, Lifting as They Climb, Mapping a History of Black Women in Chicago, and kind of trying to uplift the names and the stories of women who people really don't know about.
Yeah.
I just felt like a really intense connection to this work and to the stories that you highlighted, even though it was extremely challenging to kind of sit in that space of violence that Black women have experienced. I feel I have done work organizing around Black women who are criminalized by the state and Black women and girls who have experienced sexual violence. And I had to step away from that work. Yeah, in Chicago. Yeah. And I stepped away from that work because it was so heavy, and it felt like it almost feels like a failure of mine that I couldn't keep organizing because of that work. And so I wanted to ask you about what it meant, what were like the psychological impacts of the excavation of these stories, and what it meant for you to be like immersed in that world of such aggressive, racialized terror, and pain and violence, particularly on Black women. And then also what that looked like, because the archives are a particular place where it's just you and their stories, and it's such an intimate space. And so how did you kind of navigate that world, and what interventions did you have to make to sustain your own mental well-being, emotional well-being, and spiritual well-being?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for your work and your book. I relate to that question because before I went to grad school, I wanted to go to law school to do prisoners' rights law. And this was in the, 2001. And Clinton had just gutted prisoners' rights apparatuses. So, all of the funding for prisoners' rights law through the passage of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which gutted like Eighth Amendment procedures, the funding was retracted. And so I was a paralegal at that moment for the Federal Public Defender Office in New York. And I thought, okay, if I can't do prisoners' rights, I'll be a public defender. And the process of trying to narrate criminalized people into the construction of legal recognition that could possibly garner them leniency, I got really good at it. Like I lied sometimes. I made it was the narrative that was required was either the most abject subject who was not only disabled, but they were abused at home and they ran away and they were poor and poor. Like you had to be the most abject subject, or you had to be the most pious. You could not just go to church on Sunday. You had to go to church every day and you take care of 25 foster children, right? And so it's always just looking for, an object subject, an object Black subject to make recognizable to the law, to shave off a couple of months or a couple of years off of a sentence, which I was happy to do, but couldn't sustain. So that's a long way of saying, I get that tapping out, in a moment, and it's not permanent necessarily, but this is a long game. We are in a marathon, and so taking care of yourself is really important. I think that one of the ways in which I have such an intellectual and personal affinity with Dylan, though he may not acknowledge this, is that I operate a lot through anger. I don't know if you consider yourself an angry person, Professor Rodríguez, but
endless reservoirs, as we've talked about.
Yes, it really fueled me. And so I kind of I felt sad all the time, obviously. I felt depressed all the time, but I just told myself, I'm not actually digging in the coal mines. I am reading about people who did that. And if they could do that work, then I could try and write a little bit more. And so I was really motivated by both the kind of spiritual connection I had with the people who were put in such awful, torturous conditions, and hatred for the people who put them there and for the structure of white supremacy. And I actually got a lot of fuel from the structure of the archival process. So a lot of the general archival process, actually the culture of it. So a lot of the archival work took place in the Georgia Department of Archives and History, which Georgia was the only state to attempt to close its archives. State legislators just didn't want to archive at all. It was the only state in the country. That luckily didn't happen, but while I was there, I ran into some great archives at the Atlanta History Center, but at the state archives, my book was published after Alex Lichtenstein's book, which is a very thorough history of convict leasing in Georgia, in which gender is not a category of analysis, either masculinity, there's nothing about women. But what it meant is that those archives in Georgia were very well processed through the process of his book. Everything was cataloged. Archivists were familiar with everything that went on there. And so I went there very worried about what I would find, because, there had never been a book on Black women in Georgia when I went there, and no one had gone there to look at those archives. I think Talitha might have gone a little bit after me. And so Talitha LaFloria, whose book is really important and wonderful. And so I get there and they're like, you know that you're not going to find anything. So I show up to the archives and they're like, you're not going to find anything. And then you go into the reading room and there's this guy whose job was to monitor you to make sure, of course, that you didn't damage the materials or steal anything. It was just me and the guy. So essence, to your point about this dynamic of it's you in the archives and me in the archive and this guy. this white assistant archivist who said, like, I don't know why you're doing this. As I was researching, like, you're not going to find anything. And he said, we didn't put women on the chain gang. So he's invoking himself in the category of like the Jim Crow jailer. And he said, haven't you seen Gone with the Wind? Like, that's how it was. There were no women on the chain gang. And as I was pulling out pictures, he'd be like, I don't know. And so it was like, that fueled me, you know, like, there were some antagonists in the process because at first I was so scared that he was right. And then I was so angry that we didn't have the language of trolling then, I don't think, but like he was trolling me as I was doing it. And it was just a microcosm or it was an expression. It exemplified the broader field, you know, in which like gender was not supposed to be a category of analysis for carceral studies. And Angela Davis like really was an exception to that. Beth Ritchie was an exception to that. But in like formal history projects, you know, you had Callie Gross, and that was it, you know, when I was doing that research. So I was sad, but I was really angry. And I was really angry also at masculinist narratives around prison abolition that sometimes acknowledged that there were women prisoners, but never incorporated women or gender into like the founding analyses of how we got here. So to the extent that it was from slavery to Jim Crow to the prison industrial complex, you know, and it's because the research hadn't been there, but like, you know, it was like a very masculinist historical narrative that was supposed to be the foundation for how we built our organizing projects. And so that's one of the things that motivated me. Sorry, that was long.
Thank you so much.
No, that was beautiful. Essence, we're going to have to put you on that list with Corinne as a future author that will be welcome to this class as a guest as we read your book. So yeah, we've got a bunch of students in this class who are authors and comrades in all different kind of ways. So having said that, let me pass the mic over to Sally, one of our other co-facilitators who had another deep question.
Hello, thank you for this book. This is slightly tied to your response and some of the things that you've just touched on. Throughout this text, I was very aware and connected to all of the instances of resistance that were woven throughout. And I think they're really critical because in order to perform this type of labor, to perform this type of research, and to even just be reading it and receiving it, it's because so much of it deals with histories that are missing or narratives and experiences that are missing from the archives, that it's very important for people to be aware of that there is always resistance. There is always resistance. And because this work is inextricably tied to the plantation and to slavery, I remember reading that a lot of students within the States were, a lot of Black students were discouraged from, they were self-discouraging themselves from reading and learning about slavery because they were not aware of instances of resistance, whereas people who were running away, enslaved people who were running away, were resisting. All of these instances, they have precedents, that instances that you refer to, like the slowing of work, this refusing to engage in labor, et cetera, they were always there. So I really am grateful that you uncovered them within your text. I was assigned 2 questions. I wasn't really assigned, but I was encouraged to ask you 2 questions that I had. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll offer you like a smorgasbord, because there was one that Kim kind of picked up that I'm really interested in discussing. But Kim can articulate the element that they're interested in exploring. I'll leave that to them to articulate. But one of the things that I was interested in was this, the way in which your text continually showcases the way in which language was used to enact violence, whether it was through the codifying of laws, through all of these letters of support, these kind of, I guess, small scale letter writing campaigns that rendered their subjects as abject as being a condition of their release. And so I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about that, because there were ways in which the actions of women who were imprisoned resisted that kind of indexing or this fixing of being abject, through action, through their own letters requesting their release, which also spoke to their humanity that had been stripped away from them, but also the inclusion of the texts of blues songs, in which there were many forms of resistance against the kind of confining, I guess, constructs of femininity. I think there was this kind of queering that occurred of femininity in the refusal of adopting to it, that many of the women displayed. So that was one thing. I guess I could just like very simply ask you if you could speak to speech, the role of language, and different ways the ways in which you approached the language or the violence that was embedded in the text that you encountered. And then the other question that I have is around, well, I have two questions and I'll just let you answer the one that you want to. One is, I was interested in this idea of modernity and Blackness because of this idea of modernity as progress, which is always contingent on labor and invention. And the idea of ingenuity is not ascribed to Black subjects or Black individuals. And you give examples of the way in which, like the marker or a marker of modernity, the automobile, was predicated on Black labor. And so there are countless examples throughout history. Photography is one of them, in which this idea of modernist invention is contingent in subjugating Black individuals. But you also speak to different instances of Blackness and modernity as liberating. So I was wondering if you could address that. And then the other thing is this idea of dismantling. And I'm interested in that in a particular reason. But one of the texts, I made a note of it. One of the blues songs speaks to, there's a lyric that literally states, I'm going to tear your jailhouse down. And so I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that.
Okay. That is a lot, Sally. Thank you so much. I want to go backwards a little bit. So the language of dismantling is so period specific. I am a daughter of critical resistance, and the slogan prison abolition and critical resistance was dismantle, change, build, right? And that's a way of saying that abolition is absolutely about the tearing down, and it is also a project of creating alternative possibility or other worlds. So I use dismantling very intentionally because it describes the project of literally setting fire to the prison or tearing the prison down is very specific language. And it is, synonymous with dismantling. And so I strategically peppered in contemporary abolitionist language where it made sense and where it described what was happening. because it was important to signify the longue durée of Black feminist abolition. One of the arguments of the book is that there is a long history of Black feminist abolitionist thought and organizing that has been submerged, and that is existed among a kind of middle class Black leadership class where it was unexpected and where it was, you know, maybe not the most expansive expression, but it was abolitionist in character, and existed among imprisoned working class women. So that's one way of getting to the kind of question about dismantling. In terms of modernity, there are two origins to the category of Jim Crow modernity. One is in office hours with my dissertation advisor, Hazel Carby, where I was just struggling to give name to the kinds of processes I was trying to describe, in which this racialized gendering made the industrial South. And as part of making the industrial South, made a reconciliation between North and South, right? A national capitalist project that was contingent upon the imprisonability of Black women and the unimprisonability of white women, right? The absolute exclusion of white women from the system and the incorporation of Black women as prisoners and as subjects of rape and torture inside prisons. That condition, it was the was essential to the project of capitalist industrial development in the South. And so I was trying to describe, struggling to describe how to make sense of that, how to contain that in an idea. And Hazel's analysis of capitalist modernity and Black feminism and really helped me do that. And the other main person who did that was Tara Hunter. Not her, I didn't know her then, but her book, To Join My Freedom, which I so recommend as a beautiful account of the way in which Black women's bodies and labors were central to the industrialization of the Jim Crow South, and the ways in which their ideas and organizing strategically contested that industrial progress in order to carve out conditions of livability, right, for Black women and limited autonomy. This question of language is really important for the book because I was trying to think about a lot of, the relationship between the production of legal language as a technology of violence, Black women's creative forms, genres of creativity as an indictment of that legal language, the extent to which the blues predated the critique of critical race theory. And I'm not talking about a kind of liberal critical race theory, which we might identify, but a way in which the most radical edge of critical race theory is saying, you can't produce me in this way, that the law in general is contingent upon the production of a subject that is reviled, that is imprisonable, that is violable. And you can't tell us that it's a universal, neutral, objective, unmediated, ahistorical process. No, what we do is deeply deconstruct the white supremacy and the patriarchy of the law. And Bessie Smith was a critical race theorist par excellence in that tradition. And the refusals, the discursive refusals, and the signifying and the joking around the judges was all a process of doing that, and the mass culture that she and Ma Rainey and others produced that was about this deep critique of the law was something that just blew me away, you know, as well as all of the women at Parchment Farm who were doing similar work, right? And the process of ridicule, you know, had this been, you know, and we have Lead Belly, we have a blues tradition that is much more recognized, but I think that the kinds of narratives that were produced at Parchment, had they been produced by men, this deep critique of the character of violence, they would be canon, right? And so again, as I said to Essence, like anger, I'm very angry at different modes of erasure. The other way that language played a role, you're right, you know, I tried to think about demurring and the pretenses that were involved in self-narratives and parole files, the strategy involved in that. But, you know, very much influenced by Saidiya Hartman and others, you know, the absence of language, the deep absence of language. And, you know, like, very nervous to be among Leslie Alexander, but like, I learned so much from like Black feminist historians of slavery who are dealing with this absence on a scale that even the 19th century cannot imagine. So folks like Jennifer Morgan also were very influential, but like the absence of an account is an absence of language, but it's an absence of, if I connect your questions, it's a violent extermination of historical material that we might use to understand the forms of rebellion and refusal that make kind of revolutionary moments like an uprising in a convict camp or the production of a blues song, but also just the character of imprisoned women's lives. And so I was really animated by the you know, the work that was coming out as I was, I guess, revising the dissertation to be a book, Venus in Two Acts, Scenes of Subjection, around the magnitude of that violence.
Thank you both. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Sarah. You know, Sarah, one of the things that we talked about in the lead up to our conversation is how there's so many things that, I mean, this kind of echoes what Anthony was saying. There's so much you're doing in this project that we could have separate seminar conversations about each element. You know, we could have separate conversations with you about each element. And that actually leads to, I want to ask two of our student colleagues to ask to kind of more to raise their point. Some of these things are questions, some of them are just asking you to think with us. But I wanted to ask Mel and then Kim to raise your points together, and maybe just ask Sarah to think alongside and with you. Mel, go ahead, you go first.
Hi, thank you so much for your book. I found it just so incredibly powerful, and it had me thinking in the areas that you brought up, how the violence of forced masculinity on Black women. And it made me think about the level of, like, in particular, violence that Black trans women face today, and how masculinity is still is forced onto them in very violent ways. And it made me think of the connection to, like, white femininity and how white femininity is being threatened, and just, I guess, pondering and thinking about, like, oh, does that, like, contribute to the level of violence that Black trans women experience? And I think, like, at least in my experience, a lot of the times when I'm hearing people talk about transgender rights and discourse is that, you know, we're just focused on the binary, or we're just talking about gender. So I guess part of it is that I was thinking that that's an important thing for us to kind of hold, but also to see if you see that as connected, or that came up for you as you were writing, but see that the white femininity connected to the violence that's experienced by folks who are trans, in particular Black trans women, like as its connection to still protecting white femininity. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry, I'm not an academic.
That's a superpower to not be an academic, by the way. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Mel. Go ahead, Kim. Jump in with your point, because I think that they complement each other the way y'all think.
Okay. Hi, Professor Haley. Not sure if you remember me. I took your class 9 years ago at UCLA, where you taught on gender and incarceration, and you, I remember, I don't know, you were just so influential to my, whatever I am now. So I wanted to thank you for that. And also, you know, everything that we read in your class. I sound like such a creep, but I listen to podcasts about the books, and I know some of my fellow folks in this class also do. And you talk about, you know, reading Assata Shakur and all these Patricia Williams, like all these foundational texts that you then assign to us. And I feel sometimes like such a weirdo for like recommending Patricia Williams, because people are like, how did you read this? Like, or how did you come about this? And I'm like, the best professor ever, showed it to me. But yeah, I just wanted to gush about that, and how influential your book and your work and yourself as a professor, you know, has been to my goals in my intellectual life, and beyond. So some of the questions that I had about your work, and I have two, is how do you, like you talk about pulling from Venus in Two Acts, and I've been really contending, I think, with this idea around not replicating the violence that comes with archives. I work with the Southern California Library, and we talk a lot about like fugitive archives and what does that look like. So one of my questions is, how do you negotiate what to include in your book and what to keep hidden, right, or illegible? And my other question that that was the real question that I was supposed to ask, is I'm really interested in your conversations around sabotage, refusal, and essentially, right, the ungovernable, but I think the ungovernable for non-white subjects looks very different, specifically Indigenous and Black people, because we're like ungovernable from the start, savage or either non-human. So I'm really interested in this idea of I feel like you also use it as a method throughout your book. This refusal to only do history, this refusal to give us a simple, right, like contribution. You give us like 10,000 contributions. And that's something that we talked about as well. So how do you do sabotage, refusal, anarchy as method in your work, but also how are you reading it as method? If that makes sense.
And Sarah, all I'll add is that part of this comes from I think it was the first session of this year's On Violence Sequence, which is our conversation with Eric Stanley. Yeah, so we're reading you with each other. Anyway, go ahead.
Thank you. Kim, what are you working on? Did you go to Santa Barbara? Yeah. Okay. Yes. All right. It's hard to say on Zoom. I remember. Awesome. So good to see you. Like, gonna either identify you through like your project or where you're working, but of course I remember. It's so good to see you. Lovely to be with you. Okay. Hi. Oh boy. I'm gonna come back to the sabotage question because I might need you to repeat that, just in relation to some of the questions you might be thinking about with the Stanley reading, but what to keep hidden and what to try to illuminate or narrate is really hard. And related to that, I was really, as I said, influenced by Venus in Two Acts, and there's a long footnote to the beginning of chapter 2 of the book, which says I'm not doing critical fabulation, because critical fabulation has a lot of rules, and it is also based upon restraint, and is also based upon the posing of different scenarios for what may have happened. And that's very deliberate around this question of the subjunctive and the power of the conditional and what might have been. And I took a different route, which was to narrate something straight on, grounded in like a really deep archival research. But the perils of that, this is not quite about what to keep hidden, but about a related question of producing a romantic narrative, trying to resolve the absences of the archive. And I chose to perform a resolution to expose what was not there, but to be very clear that it was a kind of break and a performance. Because I felt like what was not there was so violent, and that all I can describe that as is relation, Black women's relation, was so, that absence was such a deep annihilation of life, both for those who lived it and for us. In thinking about, and this relates to the first question, I'm sorry, who asked that? Where did they go? I'm sorry, I don't remember the first person's name who asked that question.
That was Mel.
Mel, okay, Mel. Mel's question about the kind of character of violence, of gender and sexual violence, but in particular of gender violence. And so the eradication of relation and the brutalization of Black women prisoners is a form of carceral gendering that is about the production of normative femininity that renders Black quote unquote women as queer, and that is prototypical of absolutely what we have now in terms of deep, terroristic, brutal assault on Black people in general and Black gender nonconforming people, whether that's non-binary or trans folks. I view the history in No Mercy Here as very prototypical of that. And that is about how the prison operates, to borrow from my dear friend Dylan Rodríguez, as a regime rather than as a discrete institution, right? These are gendering orders. These are regimes that impact, that crystallize the logics of gendered white supremacy for those inside and outside of cages. And yes, the closing argument of like the devil incarnates, was about trans prisoners. In fact, the person in Trump's video was Shiloh Klein, who is someone who was in deep relation to California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and who was an activist, is an activist community. But yeah, so the closing argument might have been around Black queer prisoners, Latinx prisoners, but of course, it's about the broader annihilation of gender dissidents and the broader annihilation of prisoners and Black people. And so I see very little daylight. And I'm not an Afro-pessimist, though I have Afro-pessimist tendencies, I will admit. But I see little daylight between Eliza Cobb and Shiloh Klein, or Maddie Mae Crawford, you know, who was disposable insofar as they could be rendered gendered other and publicized in that way, and Shiloh Klein. It is about the production of an excluded category. And you know, I don't want to like, there are differences. White women were absolutely excluded from the prison, unless you count the 5 white women who were in prison in any given year in the Jim Crow South. And that is different from today. But if you look at the dynamic of this particular moment in which white women voted for Trump as an alignment to white supremacy, it is a mode of like strategic political maneuvering for a kind of a continued exclusion over the bodies of Shiloh Klein and Maddie Mae Crawford as ancestor to Shiloh Klein. So we see those continuities, absolutely. I hope that made sense.
No, there's, I mean, obviously we could go on about this. So as I open it up for one more of our students who had begun to, you know, think through some of the actually a complex question that we're hoping you can help contribute to our collective thinking about. So as I call on Jazz, I want to encourage other folks who are here in attendance who want to ask or raise something or think alongside and with Sarah. Please feel free to just put your name to just say so in the chat or raise your digital hand, and I'll get to you as we go into our last 20 or so minutes with Sarah. Of course, I have my own thought I wanted to share with Sarah, but you know, maybe I'll compartmentalize that. I'll wait until other folks have had a chance, because Sarah, I can always just call you. So Jazz, so where's Jazz? There's Jazz. Jazz, go ahead and unmute and share your thoughts.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here. I feel really, really lucky to be able to ask you this question and to think with you. And I fucking loved your book so much. So many different ways. Everyone's already talked about it, so I don't want to blab on about it too much. But I think the main thing, like you already said, that I most appreciated about your book was how you show that gender is baked into the practices of the prison, regardless of actually, I mean, it is important who the subject is. You're specifically looking at positionalities of Black women, incarcerated Black women, but also the function of the prison in itself is gendered and racialized, right? So I really love that, and I'm gonna read your stuff in more detail again and really try to use it a lot in the work that I'm trying to do. My question is, and I think I'm the only person in this reading group that is maybe not from the US or not based in the US. So I'm coming from like a very different context here. And this is not like any at all criticism of your book, but it's just a question that I guess we grapple with here in this settler colony of Australia, where, and it's the experience of many people around the world, not just us, but you know, the Indigenous people here were racialized as Black, similar to the New Zealand, you know, the Polynesian Panthers. We had the Black Power movement as well here in the 1970s. So our native people, I guess, were also racialized as Black. So we kind of like mesh those two things together in our theorizing. We don't separate them, right? And I'm not at all trying to, you know, reduce any complexities. And obviously, enslaved people are also Indigenous. They were kidnapped from their Indigenous lands, right? But something that really gets centered and talked about and emphasized in the movement over here is, and we have a very different, you know, makeup of people that live here, it's that the sovereignty of the people whose lands that you're on, that you're situated on, matters. because the penal systems were designed and constructed specifically to eliminate their land, systematically rape the women, steal their children, and exactly everything what you talk about in your book, right? So it matters where it happened and to who it happened. And so, you know, we have like African refugees. They are also indigenous, many different types. Like I could be considered indigenous as a Kurdish person, although that social category hasn't really been theorized to my people, so I don't really like to like use that thing. So there's lots of indigenous people from lots of other places, but the thing is like we try to center the land that we're situated on in our praxis, in our movements, and in the work that we do. And sometimes it's hard to, I'm just going to be really blatant and straightforward, and people can disagree with me and whatever, but sometimes maybe there's a lack of translation, or we don't see that maybe happening in the US or something, in the sense that a lot of the abolitionist literature, you know, does talk about centering Black women, which is really important, but it's not Black and Indigenous women. So I don't know, Dylan, if you want to build on that or like add anything.
Yeah, no, so Jazz brought this up in our preliminary conversation, Sarah, and I was saying that what I detect in the North American abolition context is in many circles is a version of the converse, in which generally recently engaging abolitionist folks or recently identifying abolitionist folks, especially non-Black abolitionist folks, have very often had a tendency to abstract the ways in which they're engaging with abolitionist praxis, abstract it away from the diasporic Black radical and revolutionary genealogy of abolition. So I think we're talking about these tendencies that are simultaneous with each other and that present all kinds of problems, actually, and all kinds of tensions that can sometimes confound how these movements work, especially at the level of the assumption of shared premises, which they may not have. Right. So like all different kinds of abolitionists, sometimes sitting at the same table, they may not share the same affinity with a presumed abolitionist genealogy, right? And it might have nothing to do with one while everyone assumes it has to do with the other. So yeah, we just want to get.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I think that the genocide that that settler colonial genocide proceeded in part, in large measure, through the labor extraction of enslavement, and that the mobilization of labor for the theft of land and genocide of indigenous people in the US was advanced at the point at which something like the convict lease system was created in the South. Not complete, but advanced. And so I wouldn't say, I'm trying to think about whether I would say that convict labor or chain gangs was about that project in the way that slavery was. I think that at that point, it just depends on when you're looking. Of course, the turn of the century was a time of incredible genocidal violence for indigenous people throughout the country, but the production of Southern industrial capitalism via the labor extraction and brutalization of Black people, I think, is specific. And I think that that is also true of the particular kind of carceral abolitionist philosophy that emerges from slavery through the 21st century. And I think it operates, I think that the relationship that it's important for further research to develop is the forms of warfare that resource extraction made possible, that accelerated and facilitated the further genocide and settler colonial project that in particular, the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, you know, in the US context, that in those 2 centuries in that produced. So I think it's a relation. I think that it's important for theorists and historians to think about that relation, but I do think that there's something, maybe is what I'm trying to say, about the kind of historical precision that kind of relational work makes possible. So there's something, I think that it is important to understand the convict labor system as a form of facilitation of gendered racial capitalism, industrial capitalism, that is going to complete a project of settler colonial empire building, but in a very specific way through kind of processes of anti-Black, gendered and racial annihilation. And that will be contested through specific modes of Black radical refusal and rebellion. I think it's tough. I think
Yeah,
these
I
are,
mean,
I
yeah, I
think
mean,
that
again,
it
this
is
is
important to be both specific and relational. And that I would want, like, I would really, like, I would want to think about, for example, the ways in which the coal extraction that convict labor produced contributed to, like, you know, the modes of domestic warfare against indigenous people that takes place at the turn of the century. That was beyond the scope of No Mercy here. And I would say that Black women and Black feminism aren't, and particularly in the time of that writing, but still aren't always centered in abolitionist frameworks. And so that was the central project of this book. But I think that kind of work of thinking about the material and ideological resource mobilization and subject construction is so vital.
what you're making me think about, Sarah, and what your book I think makes a lot of us think about, all of us think about, is and thank you, Jazz, for raising this question, is number one, that you know, the tendency is we want schemas. We want schemas that will just make sense of all this, of all the layers of extraction, of violence, of humiliation, of demoralization, et cetera, right? And schemas just sometimes they don't fucking work, right? Like everybody should have learned this by now, but we haven't, you know, and this is one of the curses of being in a position of inhabiting, you know, academic spaces in a sense, but also just generally spaces of urgent intellectual practice, including praxis and organizing, right? Which is partly, significantly, centrally in intellectual practice. Like we want schemas to make sense of things, even if it's just for the moment. And sometimes those schemas just don't work. So what you're raising for us, I think, is first of all, a notion of labor that is centered on that labor as Black women's convict labor, captive labor, alongside, as you reference more than once in the text, Hortense Spiller's durable, indelible notion of flesh. And now, thanks to Jazz for grounding it alongside all of the layers of violence, negation, extermination, et cetera, and sometimes forced preservation that come with conquest. So colonization, but not just colonization, also conquest as the ongoing process of occupation and so forth. So all this, so there's a lot more to be said here. We're reaching the end of our time, so I want to ask Leslie and Anais to maybe ask you all's questions back to back with each other, and then we'll go from there. And if that's it, that's it. If there's a couple seconds after that, then I'll raise my thing, but that's not a priority. Leslie, you go first, and then we'll go to Anais.
Thank you. Sarah, thank you so much for being here to think with us about your work. I think your book is absolutely brilliant, and just really appreciated the chance to be in conversation with the group and with you about it. I feel like in a way I kind of would just want to thank you for writing it, because it's such an important work and you do it so brilliantly. I feel really grateful to you for writing it. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to try to make them quick because I know we're short on time and I actually have to scoot out a couple minutes early. But one question I wanted to ask you is just if you could say maybe just a word or two about your writing process. One of the things I really appreciated about your book is that you were able to actually take kind of like complex theoretical concepts, but articulate them and explain them in really useful, concrete ways that I feel like you don't have to be an academic to get it, even though it's very scholarly and brilliant. You don't have to be an academic to understand what you're saying. So I was just wondering if you could maybe, I'm curious, I guess, first and foremost, of like whether that was intentional on your part, like if you were envisioning wanting this to be a book that's like accessible beyond the academy. But also if you could just kind of talk about how you went about doing that. And in a way, I actually think this question that Nikel asked in the chat gets a little bit at the other question I was going to ask you, which is I'm part of like a group of faculty. They're just trying to help each other like think through our next projects. And we just recently did an exercise where we all ran around and offered, like, we were asked to like give a why as to the reason why the project that we're working on matters so much to us. And I was really struck by what you said about the anger, like being angry. And I was just wondering, like, if you are interested or like willing to share with us like your why, like why was this topic and this like project, you could have written about a lot of things, but you wrote about this. So I'm just curious, like, about if you're interested or willing to share. I can't help but be curious, like, your why, like, what it is that made this a book that you really want to write. And thanks again for writing it.
Great.
Okay, yes. Oh, we have some feedback. You need to turn off your audio. Or someone does.
I'm unmuted. I was a problem. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Haley, for I learned so much through reading this book. I had a really specific question as a musician. So you were talking in the first chapter about how women were sometimes arrested for vagrancy, although not as often as Black men. And you were saying that women were often charged as vagrants because they were allegedly prostitutes. And so I was curious about like other cases of vagrancy, especially because in the 5th chapter, you talk about blues. If some of these vagrancy charges, if in the archive you ever came across vagrancy charges related to musicians busking on the streets, playing music on the streets, and whether like musical expressions were considered vagrancy.
Thank you. Okay. Leslie, can you repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, I was just the first part of my question was just about like your writing process,
Oh.
like, you know, how you were able to take kind of complex theoretical
Oh, right.
concepts and make them
Okay.
accessible. And if
Sorry.
that was like an intentional thing on your part, like if you
Yeah.
had an audience in mind.
Okay.
And then Sarah, if it's cool, I wanted to close out. Essence had one more question to close us out after this, and I promise.
Okay. Yep.
And I just want to say, I know times are really bleak right now. And when we're looking at these historical patterns of like incarceration and state violence against Black women through the Jim Crow era, it parallels to violent criminalization that's taking place today. I did feel like there was a moment, which you kind of ground in your book, like, or a little bit in a different language that I read, but about the case for Marissa Alexander. You published in 2016. I think she wasn't released until 2017, but there was like this moment, 2016, 2017, where people were really talking about the disproportionate sentencing. It was just, it felt, and maybe that was my young organizing brain, was like, it's hope, there's hope. And then, you know, it felt like now we're careening backwards right now, and it's really hard to kind of see what the future is actually going to hold when there's so much we're up against so much violence, particularly around like the reproductive laws that are restricting the ways that Black women and girls can exert autonomy over their bodies. It's looking bleak. And so I just wanted to know, like, what are you, or what do you feel like 21st century Black radical feminists are leaning towards when it comes to like confronting these intersecting oppressions, and how might this like upcoming struggle require like a re-engagement with like the historical, I would say historical solutions or strategies that Black women have shown us are possible, that you uplift and highlight in your book. That makes sense.
Okay. I'm gonna try to go through. So my degree is in Black Studies and American Studies. So I was reading, you know, Black feminism is my historical formation, and I can name, you know, the people who I never took a class with Angela Davis, but I have a friend who did. And he said, Angela always says, keep your 7 books that like are your anchors on your desk in front of you. And most of those were Black feminist texts, and one of them would have been Hortense Spiller's Interstices and Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And so part of what I wanted to do was to prove Mama's Baby, you know. And so thank you so much, Leslie. Like, I'm such an admirer of you, and you know, thank you for picking up on the fact that part of this was to kind of give historical material to the deep truths that I had been reading for so long, and as an undergrad and a grad student and as a paralegal and all of that stuff. And so it was really intentional to be able to incorporate Black feminist theory interwoven with historical narrative. And I was lucky that UNC was okay with that. And, you know, in some ways, so the editor that I had at UNC, the only thing he didn't want me to do is use the term ungendering. So I can't even remember if it's in there. But other than that, he didn't change anything. And his thing was kind of like, I don't really know what to make of this type of writing, so I'm just gonna like not do anything. And it's a double-edged sword, because it could have been much better with a good editor, but it was very much, you know, Tara and Angela Davis and Hortense Spiller's Inside Heart, like I was trying to write in their tradition. So yeah, it was intentional. The why of the project, there's so many different ways to answer that. I grew up with my grandmother and my aunts in the Bronx, two amazing Black women, both civil service workers, and then with my dad as a single parent in Brooklyn. And the big reason for that is that my mom was in and out of psychiatric incarceration for most of her life. And so I just struggled under the magnitude of the kind of estrangement. I was always deeply in touch with the kind of estrangement that carceral infrastructures brought, and the deep violence of that. So that's one reason. And the other reason was that my dad happened to be like a Black radical Marxist. And so he had these books on his shelf, and, you know, before social media, before a lot of stuff. And so I would read a lot, and sometimes I took the books off of his shelf. And it's funny that Kim raises Asada, because I'm teaching Asada this week. So I'm still doing that in my carceral US history class. But also that was the book, that's the why, the like intellectual why. That's the book that transformed me. It's the book that taught me about the magnitude of state violence, like maybe 9th or 10th grade, just taking that book off of his shelf. And I didn't understand what the state was until I read that book. And so it made me want to only do work that confronted that violence in some way. Okay, I'm gonna get to vagrancy because that will be a little shorter. Marissa Alexander. Okay, so Essence, 26, picture it, 2016, Trump is elected the first time. And it was only a couple days after he's elected that the National Women's Studies Association was meeting in Montreal. And I was there, and Angela Davis walking around, and everyone was like, oh my God, end of the world. And I had a chance to talk to the great organizer, Elisa Bieria, who was the lead organizer in the Free Marissa Alexander campaign. And I said, Elisa, what do we do in this moment? And she said, the thing to do is we need more people in sustained organizing. And just 3 days ago, after the 2024 version of that, I had dinner with Elisa at ASA. And so I don't know what that means for the continuity and stability of anti-Black violence and like carcerality. But what it does mean is that people are fighting, and they will fight. And we have to remember that the 90s was possibly the most violent decade for like the caging of Black people since slavery, like since 1865. So the periods that don't seem that way, right? And trust me, this is not a like message about the election. We don't want to go into the politics of whether or not to vote, you know, and how to vote. But the one thing that you get from this horrible, horrible time is a little bit of clarity. And people will be fighting, and to find people where they are in fighting. And sometimes that's easier to do, is the only glimmer of hope, than in like 1993, where you have, you know, a Democratic president and the carceral, like more Black women are gonna be locked up in the period from 93 to like 99 than probably now. And to be very strategic about centering the people most vulnerable, trans folks, immigrants, Black immigrants, you know, folks trying to get reproductive care inside prisons, folks trying to get reproductive care in the South, that kind of strategic mobilizing. That's all I got. It's a horrible time.
So
Okay, in terms of musicians, the criminalization of musicians, another thing I learned from To Joy My Freedom, which discusses this, but you know, the breakup, I didn't see a lot of vagrancy around creative workers or musicians, but the breakup, of course, of juke joints and speakeasies and blues, informal blues settings, houses was very pronounced and prevalent. Atlanta was a big capital of the blues. And so I didn't see it so much in terms of vagrancy as in terms of like, there was a lot of municipal law around disorderly behavior. Yeah.
So can we please say thank you to our co-facilitators and thank you to our cherished guest, Professor Sarah Haley. Sarah, you want to know, I'll preview you what I'm going to ask you when we see each other next, but I was going to ask you, building off something Lena said in her presentation around, I was asking around fire and arson.
Yes.
And the principle of destructive. Oh, see, now we're okay. We got to do a part 2 at some point because of the way you just said yes. Because of the way you just said yes. Okay.
Yes.
So hey, Sarah, I love you. I want to tell you in front of everybody, I love you.
Love you too.
I want to say I love you to the people who are here and say thank you,
so much.
and thank each other for being here and continuing this wonderful experiment together that is ongoing. And it's an honor to be in the fight with all of you, but and today especially you, Sarah.
Thank you for this incredible discussion. Please hit me up. Please email me. Kim, I better hear from you. But everyone, please do not hesitate to write me. Like, I learned so much from being in dialogue with you, and I hope to have more conversations in the future. Love you, Dylan.
Boris, what are you going to say? I can't hang up without. Oh, okay. Thank you. No, thank you, everybody. All right, I'll see you next week. Next week we have HT Kwan, Professor Kwan, HQ, comrade, and perfect follow up to this. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for staying late. Bye, everybody.
Bye.